Thank you so much for joining us for the second annual Gabelli Fund's Columbia Business School Healthcare Symposium. I'm Bunny Ellerin, the director of the Healthcare and Pharmaceutical Management program at Columbia Business School, and I'm delighted to welcome you. While I'm speaking, feel free to use the chat box to let us know where you are calling in from or watching from. I think we have a global audience, so it'll be really great to see. Let's get some energy going. For those not familiar with the healthcare program at Columbia Business School, we are one of the premier programs in the country dedicated to training the next generation of healthcare leaders. We offer students a robust curriculum of electives that cover multiple healthcare sectors taught by world-class faculty. We also have a vast alumni network, many of whom are in today's audience, a fantastic advisory board, and a rich array of events like today's. In fact, we'll post a link in the chat box so that you can visit our website. So, what a year it's been. When we met last year at the Paley Center in person, little did we know how much our world would change in just a few months. How the issues we discussed then would become front and center today. Issues like public health policy, drug development and reimbursement, and of course, the intersection of technology with healthcare. Today, we will again address those issues, but within the context of a global pandemic, a healthcare system addressing social and racial inequities, and a country on the cusp of a new administration. There are certainly no shortage of healthcare conferences, especially today with everything virtual. You could attend many in one day. But apparently we did something right last year, because as of this morning, we already have over 1,000 people registered to attend. We're very proud of this and want to thank all of the people who made today possible. First and foremost, thank you to Mario Gabelli, class of '67. Mario, it was his idea to partner on such a conference. Thank you, Mario, for your partnership, leadership, vision, and extraordinary commitment to Columbia Business School. Next, Jing He, class of '15, who has been my partner in crime, so to speak, at Gabelli Funds in terms of organizing this conference, both last year and this year. She's been a joy to work with and a wonderful friend. I want to thank our HPM program manager, Bianca Bellino, and Gabelli team member, Matt Adelhart, for handling all of the logistics. It is not easy doing this virtually. It's actually harder virtually than it is in person. And most of all, we are so grateful to all of the speakers who are making time to be with us today. So a few program notes before we get started. I know there will be a lot of questions, so please use the Q&A box. Do not use chat, use the Q&A box. We will be monitoring it religiously, and we'll leave ample time for questions. Speaker biographies. We've got like incredible speakers today. And so we have a beautiful bio book prepared. You can download that in the chat box. There is a link, so please do so. And at the end of the first and second panels, we will have a short 5-minute break, sort of a changeover. So you can go get coffee, whatever, but come back at 10:05 and 11:05. All right, so now on to the main event. It is my pleasure to introduce the first panel, Vaccines and Therapeutics to Treat COVID-19. And really, what topic is more relevant than that? And which companies are more in the news in terms of fighting it than the three that we have? So I'd like to introduce our panel today. David Herring, the Regional President, North America from Pfizer Vaccines. Dr. Robert Paris, who's VP of Translational Research at Moderna. And Dr. David Weinreich, Senior VP Global Clinical Development at Regeneron Pharmaceuticals. All will be moderated by Jing He, Research Analyst at Gabelli Funds. Over to you, Jing and panel, and thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks, Bunny. Thanks everyone for dialing in today. We're so grateful to have COVID therapeutic and vaccine frontrunners in our panel. To our panelists, we greatly appreciate the tremendous work you and your team have done in the past months to help us get out of this pandemic. From a new disease, drug discovery to close to market in just months, you're really making history, so thank you. So first, let's start from where you are in your development. Could you help us understand where your therapy or vaccine currently are in development based on initial results, data? We've seen that your name's on the headline in the past few weeks. How confident are you about the clinical profile? Any challenges you saw when you're running these trials? Dr. Paris, do you want to share with us?
Sure. I think that we're not quite at the stage, but close to where Pfizer's at. You know, we've completed enrollment of our phase 3 trial. We have somewhere around 95% of those 30,000 participants have received at least 2 doses. Importantly, we also passed the threshold for conducting interim analysis on our phase 3 trial. And similarly, we hope that by sometime before the end of the month that we'll have both the results of that interim analysis to announce, as well as the completion of the follow-up time that the FDA has requested in their EUA guidance. So we hope by the end of the month that we'll have a package that we could be available for potential submission to the FDA for an EUA, you know, based on the risk benefits available with the data that we have, and if it is compelling to do so. I would add that, you know, I think that to date that the safety and immunogenicity profiles remains favorable towards this end. And I think some of the challenges, I think to highlight, and I think all the companies are going through this, is that running a large clinical trial in the midst of a pandemic is extremely challenging. The logistics lift, ensuring the safety of the sites, participants, and investigators. So we want to think this takes more than just a village to accomplish, to conduct this safely and with the highest degree of data and quality data that will come from these studies. I would also add that I think that an important is also the enrollment of diverse population. As you may have known, that Moderna actually slowed the enrollment of the phase 3 trial to increase this diversity. And in doing so, I think we've gotten a fairly representative study population of the US population as a whole, about 30% of the participants coming from diverse communities. In addition, we have, you know, a little over 40% of those people that are participating in the trial at one of the risk groups, the high risk groups for severe COVID outcomes. I would also add that, you know, we have a large amount of data to reconcile, analyze, interpret, write up with the highest sense of urgency, to do that with the highest quality level, so that we have, you know, a solid package of data that will allow the FDA to make a decision as rapidly as possible.
Thank you, that's helpful. How about Dr. Weinreich? How do you feel about your antibody cocktail data so far?
So far, we're really pleased with it. We're in the middle of the development plan. We're running multiple different trials in multiple different settings. Some of that has already read out, and in our outpatient study, we've publicized the first 2 analyses. Collectively, that served as the basis of the submission for emergency use that's already pending at the FDA. We have ongoing studies in hospitalized patients who require treatment, both a phase 2 study here in the United States and a phase 3 study as part of the National Health Service over in the United Kingdom, the so-called recovery trial. And we're making good progress on our outpatient prophylaxis study. But based on the data that we've seen to date, it's quite clear that the cocktail is a very, very potent antiviral. It helps clear virus in patients who are already infected. It can reduce the need for subsequent medically attended visits. And I think if this data holds, it'll dovetail very nicely with the vaccine work that my 2 illustrious colleagues are talking about for the 10% of patients who don't get a response or for whatever reason aren't vaccinated. I personally believe that, and I've said this over and over again from the very beginning, vaccines and therapeutics are synergistic. They work together. They're not competitive at all. And to actually end this pandemic, we're going to need it all to work. So Pfizer, nice job.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. So we collected questions from audience ahead of time, and a lot of them are about manufacturing and distribution. So let's start from manufacturing. Where are you in ramping up your manufacturing capacity? When do you expect your treatment or vaccines to be available to most Americans?
Sure, as a translational medicine guy, I'm stepping a little bit outside my comfort zone talking about manufacturing, but I just to sort of emphasize what I think has been shared publicly to date is that Moderna will have 20 million doses available by the end of this year, plans for between 500 million and 1 billion doses in 2021. To add to that.
Sounds good. Dr. Weinreich?
So like Pfizer, Regeneron started scale up of our antibody cocktail before we even went into the clinic. And that was partly done by us and also partly done by some forward thinking by the United States government through BARDA, who invested ahead of time in scale up. So I think we've gone public that we're going to have 80,000 doses available by the end of the November, and approximately 200,000 doses by the first week in January. Now, just to keep that in mind, these are therapeutic doses of 2 antibody cocktail put together. So the scale is obviously going to be very different than a vaccination strategy. In addition, we announced, I want to say about 2 months or so ago, a broad collaboration with Roche, where they will be providing significant additional manufacturing capabilities for our cocktail to predominantly supply outside the United States. And they expect drug available towards the beginning of 2021.
Okay, wonderful. So let's talk about distribution. The vaccines require 2 shots, 3 to 4 weeks apart. Antibody requires 1 shot. Some require cold chain, -20, -80. And also the government will likely to be involved at some point. So how do you plan to manage all these challenges that we have never done before? Dr. Weinreich, do you want to start?
Sure. One minor correction, though, is that the Regeneron antibodies tend to be very well behaved. We don't need -80 freezers. They're shipped around refrigerated. So the 2 parts to this. One is we've got a lot of experience at shipping antibodies all over the place because this isn't our first product. This will be potentially number 9, depending on the order of other things that are cooking in our portfolio. But the distribution network, at least initially, is going to be handled by the United States government. That's part of our agreement. This is all public with BARDA when they pre-purchased, if you will, several months worth of drug before we even knew that it was working. That also came along with they were going to handle the distribution. And as you can probably take as a little bit of a foreshadowing, our colleagues over in Indiana, Lilly, who also have a cocktail, they've already received their emergency use authorization, and you can see some of how they're going to be distributing it. The long-term mechanism to provide drug hasn't been worked out at this point. Let's get the EUA first, and let's deal with the initial rollout.
Good point. Dr. Paris?
Sure. I think similarly to Regeneron, we're working closely with our government partners as well. That includes BARDA, Operation Warp Speed, CDC, and really to understand how the distribution process will work, which will largely be under their direction. So, like you mentioned, we've developed a formulation to specifically allow storage at between -25 and -15, so about the temperature of your freezer at home. But with the caveat that you can do 7-day storage at 2 to 8, typical vaccine storage temperatures, 2 to 8 degrees Celsius. And then the vaccine can be kept at about room temperature for 12 hours and around 6 hours if it becomes punctured because it doesn't contain any preservatives. But I think that this type of cold chain requirement was within the scope of what can be accomplished and is going to be, but it's not going to be without challenges to deliver this many doses to the distribution networks that are needed to be covered by this vaccine. Or I would say not just vaccine, it would be vaccines. We need multiple vaccines to accomplish the public health objectives.
Thank you. That's wonderful news. So let's take a step back on safety. Your trials are going smoothly, but if you look at some of your peers who have paused their vaccine trials due to safety concerns. So how comfortable are you with the idea of vaccinating potentially hundreds of millions of people based on potential 6 to 9 months of safety data? How do you feel about that? Dr. Paris?
Perhaps similar to what David has said. So yes, we do have, we've designed a trial to generate a package of data for ensuring the safety and effectiveness of the vaccine. And ultimately, I think that there's important things to include in the designs of those trials, which is why we have a blinded protocol safety review team, as well as an independent DSMB. So there is ongoing monitoring of these trials while these happen. And I think you mentioned that a couple of trials have had to take pauses for safety events, and that's why. And that's why we are conducting these trials with this kind of safety oversight. And similarly, once the FDA will decide whether to authorize mRNA 1273, which is the terminology we're using for the vaccine, which will include 15,000 recipients of the vaccine with a median of at least 2 months of follow-up. The safety follow-up doesn't end there. Like David said, that we'll have continuous follow-up of trial participants for 2 years. But in addition, if the vaccine is authorized, then we will be continuing that safety follow-up. In addition, there's plans to also conduct further post-authorization or safety studies and effectiveness studies, in addition to what will be done normally by the CDC with their active surveillance and passive surveillance programs, which you may have heard about, the Vaccine Safety Data Link or the VAERS reporting system. All of these tools will come together that we are able to continuously monitor the safety of the vaccines even after authorization or approval.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And for Regeneron, similarly, hundreds of thousands of people may be eligible for antibody cocktail. How do you think about the safety profile, Dr. Weinreich?
Well, so far, what's been unblinded looks quite good. You have very low single-digit rates of infusion reactions. They were actually balanced between the placebo arm and the experimental arms, suggesting it's just noise. We have a lot of experience in administering our antibodies, both in infectious disease settings. This isn't our first rodeo. We've recently gotten the approval for our triple cocktail for Ebola. But it's the same fundamental platform that makes all of our antibodies, including Dupixent and Praluent and so forth. And we've got a lot of experience with them, and the antibodies are very, very well behaved. It's also public knowledge that there was a concern of a potential safety finding in a subset of patients who were hospitalized, who are also requiring high flow oxygen or mechanically ventilated. And we're currently on pause to recruitment in the US studies. But a separate IDMC looking at another hospitalized trial, same cocktail, but this time in the United Kingdom, looked at their data and recommended to continue to recruit in all hospitalized patients. So whether that turns out to something or it's just an issue of small numbers and early data is to be determined. Regeneron doesn't have access to that unblinded information because, likewise to our colleagues, we've set up our studies in blinded fashion with multiple independent data safety monitoring committees that are looking at safety on an ongoing basis.
Sounds good. So now we think about the next step. We're thinking about next spring when we potentially have some vaccine campaign strategy. How do you plan to educate the public, and what's your goal of vaccination rate? If you think about flu vaccine, we're probably at 40%, 50%. Is there an ideal number you think about, you talk about, versus a more practical number that you want to achieve? Dr. Paris, do you want to start?
I think that that one of the things that really needs to be understood is the acceptance of the vaccine. That's where we start at. And I think that's where we start by ensuring that, our partners who will be responsible for these campaigns, that the CDC have the most up-to-date information available that we can provide, because they will largely be doing the public awareness campaigns around these vaccines. In addition, we're also actively engaging the ACIP, which is the recommending bodies, and other professional organizations, as well as state immunization managers, to ensure that they have the most up-to-date information about the vaccine. In terms of vaccine coverage, I think that those sorts of decisions are really best for public health authorities. We just hope that the data that we generate with these vaccines is reassuring to the public that their willingness to take the vaccine is acceptable. And I think that if we do see a high level of efficacy, that acceptance will be quite good. I think that's been borne out by data and studies to show that. But importantly, I think that we're really relying largely on our partnerships with our U.S. government partners at CDC and WS to achieve this type of public awareness and vaccine campaign strategy.
And next step, when you think about at the end of the year, early next year, emergency use approval, the FDA has been debating about this. So how important is emergency use authorization for you, and how would that change the dynamic? Let's start from Dr. Weinreich. I know you're filing with the FDA now.
Well, I think for a therapeutic, it's a little bit different, because right now we've got, unfortunately, a large number of people dying in hospitals with the disease. And once you're infected, a vaccine isn't a viable strategy. So clearing the virus faster, reducing the impact to the healthcare system, and potentially saving people's lives is a critical need now. Until we can get a vaccine that works out in enough people that you can get herd immunity. If you're not going to vaccinate everybody, you got to vaccinate enough that you can't ping it from one person to another. So I think the need for an emergency use authorization for a therapeutic is immediate, and it's necessary. And I hope the FDA acts quickly on our application.
Wonderful. Dr. Paris, you want to share your experience?
Sure. Yeah, I think similar to Pfizer, yeah, we're aligned along the same. We intend to follow the FDA guidelines for the data package required for the review. I think that, given the trajectory of the pandemic, as you mentioned, we think it's really critical that if Moderna has evidence that this vaccine has a very favorable benefit risk profile, I think it's critical to submit this to the FDA for their review so they can decide whether to authorize this vaccine for emergency use. And that's where it really rely on this. And I think that critically, like I mentioned, like the first question around, it's really putting all of this together in a very short time. And we too also have had incredible success, I think, in doing this with our government partners. With working with Operation Warp Speed, working with our access to the FDA as Pfizer said. So it's been an incredible effort upon the amount of the government. Now it's upon Moderna's to really be able to put this together as quickly as possible so that they can evaluate the data and make that decision.
Wonderful, thank you. So we're taking questions from the audience, and this question has been asked a lot. So the question is, someday all of us will be vaccinated, there will be treatments, but I do hear that potential mutated form of coronavirus may exist. So do you believe we will be living with coronavirus like flu? Dr. Paris, do you want to start?
Yeah, I this is getting into more the biology of the virus now, right? And I think that I think before this panel started, I was sort of relaying my experience previously living in Southeast Asia when the first coronavirus epidemic started with SARS coronavirus. And at that time, and then we saw MERS coronavirus appear, 10 years later, and now now they're 9 years down the road, we have another coronavirus. So I think it's a safe bet to say that we will have potential emerging coronavirus epidemics going into the future. But as David was saying earlier, it's too early to tell. I think people have made proclamations that this virus is not mutating as quickly as flu, but I would also add that this is a very different virus than influenza. It has its own ability to reproduce itself with its own replicative machinery that corrects mistakes. So it may be able to allow very targeted mutations, which then enable it to resist immune responses and generate immune escape. To date, we don't think we have great evidence that there's been immune escape, although we've seen some reinfections. But I think only time will really tell if this comes to fruition, that we are in a position where we are trying to make different vaccines. I will say that as we at Moderna, and we will be looking at this within the context of our vaccine trial. So if we do see what we call breakthrough infections in our vaccinees, that we will try and isolate those viruses, try and sequence them so we can understand their genetic composition, compare them to the vaccine sequences, compare them to what we know is circulating, and this is part of the global virus effort, and really to see if we will, and then start generating potentially new constructs, which I think the mRNA platform is particularly amenable to, so we can keep on top of this if this virus does become and mutate to and continue to become endemic, that requires changes to vaccine rations. But again, I think it's too early to tell, and I think that it's an active area of research and development.
Sounds good. So this question is very similar. Can the current vaccine or therapeutic address the concerns of evolving mutations of the virus and still be effective? Dr. Weinreich, do you want to talk about on the therapeutic side?
Sure. So I think we know that with a therapeutic, viral escape is certainly a possibility. You can look at the escape data that came out from the single agent from Lilly that's in their fact sheet. We've published preclinical escape experiments where you utilize either one of the two agents that are in our cocktail or the cocktail together. And when you give a single antibody in that in vitro system, you can induce viral escape, much like the data that Lilly published. When you give the cocktail, it goes down exponentially. So in a forced experiment, you have to passage the virus 6 or 7 times before you start to see escape, versus with a single antibody, that escape occurs after a single passage. And that was a science paper from about 2 months ago. We already know that there are viral variants out there. There happens to be one in Scotland, which is a little bit different than the predominant variants that are over here in the US or in the rest of the UK. And we've tested our cocktail against the Scottish variant, and we neutralized that variant as well. That doesn't mean that a variant wouldn't develop that could be resistant to both of the antibodies in the cocktail. And like Moderna, we've got a strategy that we're thinking about for future therapeutics that were part of the massive thousands of antibodies that we screened, and we didn't choose for a variety of reasons, but they all bind at a little bit different spot in the receptor binding domain. And in theory, you could take one of our antibodies if a mutant strain were to develop and become prevalent, and swap out the antibody that was no longer effective in the cocktail and swap in a second antibody that would be. Now, obviously, there's we'd have to prove efficacy, we'd have to show continued safety, there are regulatory challenges, but it is something that we've thought about to keep that therapeutic option open for the group of patients that either do not get vaccinated in the long term or are vaccinated but have a suboptimal effect.
Okay, wonderful. There's a question we got a lot, which is, when will we learn the durability of the vaccines? How long will the initial vaccine administration produce sufficient antibodies? Dr. Paris?
I really don't have anything to add to that. Similarly, we're following participants in our trials for 2 years. I think that we will need to continue to do long-term immunologic studies to really understand the full duration protection for full duration of potential protection from the vaccine. So, it's not uncommon to have further studies that go 5 years, 10 years, as many vaccine companies do. So I think that won't be, again, a matter of time.
Sounds good. There's one question we got a lot. What is the timeline for pediatric use for each vaccine, therapeutics, and also for the senior population, where they are in the trial? And personally, I care that a lot, thinking about when can my kids really go back to school. Dr. Perez?
I think similar to Pfizer. So we are planning to start pediatric studies, hopefully before the end of the year. They represent potentially an expanded population based on the evolving epidemiology, as David said, that we really need to understand the transmission dynamics. And I think as that body of evidence grows, it may warrant vaccinating that pediatric population. And similarly, we've taken an approach where you establish safety in an older population, so the 18, and then in our phase 2, we then age escalated to an older adult population as we did in the phase 1. And now we're going to go down in age. And I think importantly, you have to take, baby steps, not to be, pun intended, but to really understand the safety and using different doses. So it can also require some different formulations as well, ultimately. But I try to give you an estimate of time of how long it would take. Right now, we're still working on that plan. But I think that the goal is that there may be a use for a vaccine in that population, and we'll continue our efforts along those lines.
Sounds good. Dr. Weinreich, where is your pediatric trial, or can the kids take antibody cocktail?
So this is another place where a therapeutic antibody is going to diverge pretty substantially from a vaccine. So our platform, which all of our antibodies share a wider degree of homology with, is already being used all the way down to neonates. And in our Ebola study, we enrolled pregnant women and newborns regardless of gestational age, and saw no difference based on how old the patient was. In our COVID therapeutic cocktail, we also did start with adults. Now that we've read out now twice data from our outpatient study, we have amendments pending to take this down into kids, essentially all the way down to babies. That's going to require discussions with the regulatory authorities, but we know how our antibodies perform. We've used this platform in kids, not just in infectious conditions, but also with other diseases. And there aren't, with our fully human antibody platform, there really aren't unique safety problems when you administer a human IgG against an exogenous target. I mean, we're not targeting anything that's normally present in a human. We're targeting something that's only there on the virus. So you don't a priori expect anything. And hopefully with the regulatory approval, those will kick off imminently.
Sounds good. So I have a question for Regeneron. Will Regeneron's antibody cocktail be covered by insurance? What's the estimated cost? That's a $1 billion question for you, Dr. Weinreich.
I don't know how much it is, but yeah, Regeneron has a very long history of doing the right thing when it comes to pricing its drugs. I believe the administration has already commented that the first tranche of doses that I previously discussed earlier in this webinar were all purchased by the government, and the government is going to provide them free of charge to the United States populace. We haven't made any decisions beyond that on what happens when that supply runs out, and we're now doing other manufacturing runs. But like I said, Regeneron has a history here of doing the right thing. And this stems back to our first commercial product that turned us from a a company with a lot of hope and promise to, a real commercial stage company with Eylea, that once we launched it, we haven't taken a price increase. So, I'd like to think that our ethics and our true north around this is going to stay. I'm 100% certain that's going to be true, even though that's Len and Marion's area, not mine. But I just don't have a specific answer for you at the moment.
Of course, thank you. And also, let's talk about where we are today. There are still over 1,000 deaths per day in the US, despite that remdesivir is widely available in the US at this point. So how would your therapeutic or vaccines improve the situation? When should we really expect to see an inflection point? Do you want to start, Dr. Weinreich?
Sure. So I think the first step is preventing patients from getting all the way to being on the ventilator. And that is what is pending in front of the FDA in our emergency use authorization. It's been pending there several weeks. I'm crossing my fingers that we're almost there. But it's clear that you want to intervene early. Now, I don't know what is the true situation with either what happened to our colleagues' antibody in the Operation Warp Speed Active 3 study, where the IDMC closed down the recruitment, or what our IDMC saw in 2 of the cohorts from our hospitalized trial, nor can I reconcile that with the IDMC's recommendation from the recovery study in the UK to continue going. My hope is that this all turns out to be small number statistics and not an actual signal. That's a forward-looking statement that I'm hoping for, and that you can actually clear virus in patients who are incredibly sick and help get them off the ventilator. That's an open scientific question at this point. What we know now, and it's been replicated by both us and Lilly, is when you get infected, getting rid of the virus is a good thing. And your body's natural immune system is generally capable of doing it, but it doesn't do it in everybody. And these exogenous antibodies are an immune system in a vial, and they can improve outcomes from these, early trials. And I think that's probably why Lilly got their EUA, and we're hoping that FDA does the same thing. And it's needed right now because, as you point out, once you've got, and I said earlier, once you've got the virus, a vaccine is not the right strategy. It's not a ding on a vaccine. I am rooting for all of the vaccine companies because that's the long-term solution, because you could never make enough antibody to treat everybody that gets infected. There's just not enough manufacturing capability on the planet to do that. You've got to prevent people from getting infected. But once they're infected, then you need a therapeutic.
It's a really good point. Dr. Paris, how is this different from your experience with the past pandemics?
Yeah, so I would say that, obviously a vaccine is probably the one tool that we need right now to really impact the pandemic in terms of preventing people from getting infected. I think obviously all the other public health measures, those we can't stop once we have a vaccine if we want to get back to normal. And I continue to emphasize that public health message here, that a vaccine will work, but we don't know how well it will work yet. So I need to continue to emphasize those other public health measures, including mask wearing, hand washing, and all, and everything, the advice that we continue to receive. I think too that on past pandemics, this virus has been managed without a vaccine. But however, this is different. This virus has shown itself to be very wily and highly transmissible, and so I think with current vaccines, and if we get the vaccine coverage that we talked a little bit about earlier and getting that acceptance, I think we have a really good chance of controlling the pandemic ultimately.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Being a biotech analyst, looking at all your data and all of your conference calls, it's really exciting time. And being an ex-Regeneron employee as well, really exciting time. So thank you so much. We sincerely hope your treatment or vaccines will be approved, become available soon. And hopefully we can meet in person in November 2021 for our third annual healthcare conference.
Thank you all so much. This was incredibly interesting. We had so many questions, and as Jing said, let's hope we meet in person next year.
That'd be great.
And guys,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.